Okay, we're live. Good evening, afternoon, early evening to all those who are watching. Um, we're we're uh, we're tackling the fantastic imagination, but right now we're just reminiscing on how we met, how we all kind of bumped into George MacDonald. And I would like to introduce Josh, who is largely responsible for me discovering these two essays, The Imagination and The Fantastic Imagination. So, and Josh and I have kind of been communicating and looking at different books all for the last, I don't know, how many years is it now, Josh? 4? 5?
Wow. At least three. I don't know.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. So, anyway, we were all just kind of reminiscing about how we met George, and Jason was in the middle of telling us, his story. So continue, Jason.
All right, you guys got to retell yours, right? um, but anyway, yeah, I was saying that I think it was when I was on the Discord server, and I can't remember what I asked. I asked some question, and then Luke Thompson responded, and then you, Sherry, sent me the Justice sermon by him. And so I read it, and I remember being, just, I thought it was incredibly fascinating, being really moved by it, and very compelling, but I didn't even pay attention to who the author was. Like, I had no idea who wrote it. I just read this essay. And then I don't know how long it was. It might have even been a year. And then I was just doing my podcast and just talking to other people. And it was an ex-girlfriend of mine, and was still a good friend. And she was telling me the story about how she had died on the birthing table, and just kind of telling her whole story. And she's struggling with some medical problems and things like that. And then Christian Golden, who's also on the Discord server, listened to it, and he suggested that she read George MacDonald. And so I went to a used bookstore, and the only books they had from him were like maybe 3 copies of Fantasties. And like I said before, I read the title and it says on there fairy romance. So it's just like, well, this is for girls. I'm not going to. And I was just like, well, I'll just buy a copy for myself anyway. And as soon as I opened it and read the first, it doesn't even take the first chapter. It's just like the intro is just had me hooked. And then after that, I just, basically bought everything I could come across. Mostly his stories. I haven't read all his unspoken sermons yet. I have it, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, I haven't finished them either. I got, I think, halfway through the unspoken sermon.
Dense.
Yeah,
They're meaty. Yeah,
they are. They're really good.
yeah.
So, I had a question for you now. Oh yeah, was this during, like, when you discovered Fantasties in that bookstore? That was already having been part of this community, right? The Discord community and stuff.
Yeah. If I wouldn't have ever found him, if it wouldn't have been for, well, you guys initially turned me on to him, but it was him because I wasn't paying attention. And then Christian Golden was also in the Discord server, was the one who, mentioned him.
Yeah,
but, it comes at the perfect time too, because it was like, it's that book. Just, I'd like to say that book saved my life. It saved me in a lot of ways, because it was really, you kind of feel like you're lost at some points in life, and you're wandering through the woods, and that's kind of what that book is in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It kind of guides you through it, and I really think it'll guide people through depression too in a lot of ways. It's
Definitely. What about you, Jedediah? How did you stumble into George?
I do remember long ago, in the 90s, running into like a couple of his unspoken sermons when I was attending Bible college. And I thought they were good, but it just didn't land, and I didn't put much thought into MacDonald, other than, knowing that he had some influence on Tolkien and Lewis, who I really loved reading very much. So it's like always kind of like maybe a mental note, someday go explore his stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually, my kind of first serious readings were in the unspoken sermons, as I was beginning to explore Christian Universalism back in like 2015, 2016.
Okay.
And so The Consuming Fire was like had a huge impact on me.
Mhm.
And I love his unspoken sermons. I have several of them. And then I've read Lilith,
Yeah.
which I absolutely loved. And then, the essays that we've been reading here on the imagination, and now fantastic imagination.
Mhm.
And, I find that he's one of those guys that once you kind of get a feel for him, it's like hard to turn away.
Yeah.
He's pretty amazing. So
Yeah.
just like, like Jason says, yeah, it's good for the mental health to read somebody with the spiritual power and clarity of a George MacDonald.
Yeah. Yeah. And I find too that there's always like this golden thread of optimism
Mm-hmm.
in George MacDonald, right? Of hope, because to me anyway, he's really showing us the Father,
Mm-hmm.
right? The fatherhood of God. And but what I find super fascinating is how low he flies under the radar. It's like
Yeah.
he's like this little stealth bomber,
Yeah. One of the things that when you were saying that too, I think like one of the things I find him to be, and I don't mean this in a negative sense, he's very severe in his writings.
Yes, he is.
Like there's an urgency
Yep.
to the whole. There's like he's like under the weight of being itself.
Yes.
I think he writes under that gravity, and thinking of the sermon that he had on the uttermost farthing, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way he was presenting the Christian universalist understanding, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like more terrifying than eternal conscious torment.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Exactly.
when you understand what he is communicating, he's communicating that you can never escape yourself.
Right.
Right. And so you're going to have to deal with yourself, and you're going to have to deal with God.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it's wrapped in this deeply loving, deeply merciful, gentle writer, but it's like it's just incredibly powerful.
Exactly. Yeah. It must just come out of love, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like love for humanity, love for like the urgency is almost like he wishes we could see what he sees,
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
and one of the things that I found through reading him, and the whole idea of like what you were saying about it being worse than eternal conscious torment, right? The universalist message
Mm-hmm.
was that it was wrapped up in this call to holiness that I had never actually felt before in my Christian life.
Mm-hmm.
But in a like you said, in a really severe way, but at the same time, even though you knew that it was severe, you could feel the severity of it. It somehow drew you in, right?
Mm-hmm.
To go to that place, like to want to be holy, to want to participate in that, right?
Yeah.
As difficult as it is. So anyway, yeah. Mm-hmm. If I talk any more about him, I'll start to cry.
I know. Right? Well, we got to hear a little bit about how Josh encountered MacDonald, but I don't think the listening audience has had the chance to hear. So, Josh, do you mind sharing with us, like, kind of your introduction to George MacDonald?
Yeah.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, we were on the Bridges of Meaning Discord back in the early days of it, whatever year that was. I don't even remember now, but so I think Sherry was probably in the middle of what she was talking about earlier of first reading George MacDonald's Justice Sermon. And I think she asked if she could read some of it out loud, just kind of randomly, kind of jumping into the Discord chat. And everybody said, yeah, sure, fine. And reading some of it. And that was my first introduction. And I remember being really caught by the idea that justice is really more about reconciliation than it is about vengeance or retribution and being caught enough. And then I remember, hey, we're doing a discussion on George MacDonald, a chat on it, and I was happy to join that. And that's when I got into MacDonald.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
And then Sherry, how about you? Because I don't think you've shared here.
Yeah. Well, like I said earlier, I someone gave me at the Back of the North Wind by George MacDonald, and there's another fairy tale in there. I can't remember which one. And I also had The Wise Woman and a little book with The Wise Woman and another one for years on my bookshelf. And when my oldest daughter, who's now 40, was 3, I decided to read her At the Back of the North Wind. And I remember thinking to myself, whoever this guy is, he's nuts. Like, I really did think that.
Mm-hmm.
And so and she enjoyed it. Like, she was 3 and she was into it, like I said, like when she saw me that one day, she's, Mommy, you're the North Wind, like her imagination was just on fire, right? Listening to this story. And I was so confused. I stopped reading it to her.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't finish it. But yeah, so it was through Luke Thompson, who sent me the Justice Sermon, and I read that, and I read it out loud to myself and just wept. There were certain portions of that sermon that I couldn't not cry. There was a lot and it felt really like burdens were being lifted and I was being cleansed and all kinds of bizarre stuff. It was so weird. So yeah. And then after that, like Josh said, I was just, on fire about this justice sermon. I was talking about it to everybody and then it was Josh that turned me on to the Fantastic Imagination. And I don't remember if I found the Imagination, Its Function and Culture, the one that we just went through, but yeah. And it's just been a slow, people I know have said, hey, have you read, like Jess recently read The Karasoin, which was amazing. And The Castle.
You read it?
I did.
We should talk about that because I haven't. I mean, at some point, not now, because I read it once, like a year and a half ago, and I don't remember hardly any.
And then I told Michael Martin to read it.
Looks up somehow. Yeah,
I told Michael Martin to read The Karasoin, and at the last Meditations on the Tarot, he's like, Sherry, I read The Karasoin. That George is in it. George is in it. Yeah. I'm like, I know, he's so in it. Yeah, and that's probably what freaked me out about him when I read At the Back of the North Wind, because I'm like, this man is like, where the heck is he? Like, I actually kind of thought he was slightly crazy. Like, yeah. I did.
I don't know. Like you said, there's something about it.
I was gonna say he's the very best kind of crazy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I can see how, like, if you're not like in the kind of accustomed to the kind of thinking that that he presents to us, it can probably be. I remember even like as like just a run-of-the-mill evangelical reading this as a 20-year-old coming out of youth group culture. It was like incomprehensible to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
I thought it was like really interesting and fascinating, but I don't even think conceptually I could understand what he was really talking about.
Yeah. And I think the Justice Sermon was a really good first step for me because of that. Like you were saying, that, evangelical background, right? It was more propositional language and I was used to it. I was used to the sermon style, to find out information. And interestingly enough, like, cause I kind of binged the sermons for like half of them I read in order. Right. And then I started into the fairy tales, Lilith and Phantastes and stuff. And I could then identify where the theology was in the stories. And that really opened up the stories more for me. And then reading the imagination essays also gave me more insight into what he was doing in his fantasy.
Well, in the essays, what's really interesting, what I think we talked about this in one of our discussions, but you get a sense of the breadth of his knowledge,
Right.
because he's not like citing philosophical sources or anything like that in his sermons or in his novels, which why would he, but like, just, you can tell that that he is well acquainted with, several schools of philosophy, incredibly well acquainted with the arts. I mean, the circles he was running in, he was friends with Alfred Tennyson and Lewis
I know.
Carroll, and it's like some of the great literary giants of the Victorian era he was friends with. And so, I mean, he was no slouch in terms of just how how incredibly wide and deep his knowledge was, just of the Christian tradition, of the arts, of literature, of philosophy. It's pretty powerful.
Yes.
Like there were sections where when I'm listening to him, I'm like, he had to have been reading Hegel in order to come to these kinds of conclusions.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting, because, like, I mean, philosophically, he's basically a Neoplatonist, largely, but it's interesting that there are certain things where he's bringing in some very contemporary. I mean, that's, within just a few years of, him emerging, he's 60 years after Hegel, 70 years maybe. And so it's very interesting.
Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah. Yeah. But, going back to this flying under the radar thing, I find it really interesting. And when I discovered the Hidden Life poem, and I had to read it because I think it really reflects who George is, how he sees his calling, in a sense. Like, in that poem, he's a really, whoever, the main character is, he's really smart. Like, his teachers just want him to go, into academia, and he rejects all that and stays on the land and takes over his father's farm. And he marries what he learned in academia with the life that he lives. And he, in that section that I've read before, where he talks about, trying to help the whole world, and he, he says, well, it's better for me to help the world that I have at my disposal, and let God take care of the rest. And so there's just this incredible humility to him that actually lives, like, the spirit of it, to me, lives on in his works, because he isn't way up there in everybody's view. You have to find him, and so it makes him hidden, right? Just like the poem, A Hidden Life. He is essentially hidden, and you have to be curious enough to find George. So anyway, I just had to say that because I think it's true. All right, so I guess we could start reading. We just do, Josh, we do a little bit, like, kind of a read through thing. Someone reads a couple paragraphs or whatever, and then we just discuss it. So I don't know, Jed, do you want to start?
I'm going to have a little bit of trouble when he gets into the German term, because for whatever reason, my font is totally screwed up.
It's Maerchen, which is Märchen.
Märchen? Okay.
Which is the German word for fairy tale. And then I texted my family this afternoon just because, out of curiosity. I wanted to know the etymology of the word. I got to find my notes here. Hang on, where did they go? Here. And interestingly, I think I put it in the chat. Oh, wrong spot here. So It's basically just a tale of renown.
Okay.
Is the etymology of the word mer,
Okay.
and the word mer comes forth in Old English and Old Norse, and so it's an Indo-European word probably.
Okay.
And it's also there in the German etymology. It specifies an invented tale, so an imaginary, right? Erfundene is the word that they use, and that means, imaginary or discovered or something like that.
Okay.
So, but it's the only word they have in German for a fairy tale, and it doesn't actually include the term fairy. It's a Märchen isn't a fairy tale, right? But
Okay.
that's our English word. So
Okay. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and get going here. So MacDonald begins that we have in English no word corresponding to the German Märchen drives us to use the word fairy tale, regardless of the fact that the tale may have nothing to do with any sort of fairy. The old use of the word fairy, by Spencer at least, might, however, well be adduced were justification or excuse necessary where need must. Where I asked, what is a fairy tale? I should reply, read Undine. That is a fairy tale. Then read this and that as well, and you will see what is a fairy tale. Were I further begged to describe the fairy tale or define what it is, I would make an answer that I should soon think of describing the abstract human face or stating what must go to constitute a human being. A fairy tale is just a fairy tale, as a face is just a face. And of all fairy tales I know, I think Undine the most beautiful. Many a man, however, who would not attempt to define a man might venture to say something as to what a man ought to be. Even so, I will not in this place venture with regard to the fairy tale, for my long past work in that kind might poorly instance or illustrate my now more mature judgment. I will but say some things helpful in this reading, in right-minded fashion, of such fairy tales as I would wish to write or care to read.
Okay, let's talk about these two, because I think he makes some really great critiques here under the, kind of little sleight of hand critique. So, I can say that I really loved when he said, "Were I further begged to describe the fairy tale or define what it is, I would make answer that I should as soon think of describing the abstract human face, or state what must go to constitute a human being." And then a little further down, he says, "Many a man, however, who would not attempt to define a man might venture to say something as to what a man ought to be. Even so much I will not in this place venture with regard to the fairy tale, for my long past work in that kind might but poorly instance or illustrate my now more mature judgment." So, and you'll see further down as you read that he really doesn't want to define anything in that sense. He some things he does, some things he talks about definitively, right? Like the law, for example. But when it comes to the human being, the face, the fairy tale, he's not doing it. And you can't make him. He just won't do it. Anyway, I just love that about him.
Mm-hmm.
Have you guys read Tolkien's, what is it called? It might be called On Fairy Tales.
No, I haven't.
Oh, shoot.
Is it in his letter?
No, it's a lecture he delivered at one point.
Well, that might be worth looking at too.
And you can find it kind of in essay form. I believe it's called On Fairy Tales. If I try and look it up, I'm on my phone right now, and I'll probably do something goofy and
I can look.
and leave the chat or something if I try and look it up.
Okay. Yeah, and I was trying to look up because I'm unfamiliar with Undine.
I was wondering about that too.
it appears to be like, at least at some level, a mythology, possibly surrounding a water nymph who falls in love with a human man.
Yeah. Yeah, I looked it up.
Okay.
Undyne. I thought, well, I better read it. If George recommended it, I should read it.
Do you think there's crossovers between the Little Mermaid story? Because I don't know. It just says a water spirit marries a knight and named Huldbrand in order to gain a soul. Huh? It's
Probably.
in German. It's in German.
So it's called, that thing is, Josh, is called On Fairy Stories, an essay by Tolkien which discusses the fairy story as a literary form. It was written as a lecture entitled Fairy Stories for the Andrew Lang Lecture at the University of St. Andrews on the 8th of March, 1939.
Yep, that's it.
The essay is significant because it contains Tolkien's explanation of his philosophy on fantasy and thoughts on mythopoeia. Moreover, the essay is an early analysis of speculative fiction by one of the most important authors in the genre, alongside his 1936 essay, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. It is his most influential scholarly work. Wow. Okay.
So, just a side note here. I guess I watched this movie with Colin Farrell called Ondine with O instead of U. And I was trying to look it up. I don't know if they're related, but I put an Ondine story and it says the nymph Ondine was an immoral water spirit who became human after falling in love for a man, marrying him and having a baby. So I don't know if they're related.
Yeah, it's
The
also,
movie
it
was
looks
really good.
at least Encyclopedia Britannica says that she also goes by Ondine.
Oh, okay.
So-
Yeah, the movie. If you want to watch the movie, it was a good movie. I thought it was, at least.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for the movie recommendation.
What's it
It
called? I
ties in-
missed that for some reason. You cut out.
It's called Ondine. It's the same spelling except with the O. It's got Colin Farrell in it, and I saw it on like Amazon Prime, and I was like, this looks pretty boring. But for some reason, I clicked on it, and I actually thought it was really amazing. I thought it, gosh, what is it? It's not. Oh, it's Selkie. That's what it is. It's not necessarily water nymph. They're talking about in the movie. It's more about a Selkie, which is kind of like a mermaid, but it's like they're more like look like seals or something. They're in fairy stories, but they, it was really cool because it kind of blends. It's very practical, and you see how the fairy story actually could manifest in like the natural or something like that. I don't know. It was really neat. I would definitely recommend it. It was a fun movie, and it was a really beautiful movie too. And stuff, so.
All right. You want to read on, Jed?
I'll be happy to. Let me just get to my spot here. So, some thinkers would feel sorely hampered if at liberty to use no forms but such as existed in nature, or to invent nothing save in accordance with the laws of the world of the senses. But it must not therefore be imagined that they desire escape from the region of law. Nothing lawless can show the least reason why it should not exist, or it should exist, or could at best have more than an appearance of life. The natural world has its laws, and no man must interfere with them in a way of presentiment, any more than in the way of use. But they themselves may suggest laws of other kinds, and man may, if he pleases, invent a little world of his own with its own laws, for there is that in him which delights in calling up new forms, which is the nearest perhaps he can come to creation. When such forms are new embodiments of old truths, we call them products of the imagination. Apologies. We call them products of the imagination. When they are mere inventions, however lovely, I should call them the work of the fancy. In either case, law has been diligently at work.
Anybody have any thoughts there?
No, I might need you guys to help me break that down. What's he saying exactly?
And I apologize, I'm covering for work, so I'm just going to mute myself real quick. I'll be
Sure.
back shortly.
No worries. Well,
So when such forms are new embodiments of old truths, we call them products of the imagination. When they are mere inventions, however lovely, I should call them the work of fancy. In either case, law has been diligently at work.
Right. And he's going to expand on that. So
Oh, okay.
he's going to talk about the law. That's actually the main body of the essay is the law that imagination finds itself beholden to, and what happens when you don't. Geez, my brain is really missing out on vocabulary today. When you don't adhere to the law, right?
Yeah.
And this is similar to the other essay, Jason, where when he talks about our creative abilities. So, like he says, remember in the other essay, he said at one point, we're basically taking what already exists, and because the meaning is already within those things, right? Creation itself, like the trees and the wind and all, there's a meaning already contained within those forms. That we're not actually creating ex nihilo. He reserves that for God, right? Creating from nothing. We create from something. So we create from the things that God has made, which gives him justification for saying that it's in God's imagination that we live and move and have our being, right? Because we're actually functioning within all the things that God imagined. The world, the cosmos, the trees, the animals, the relationships, the wind, the rain, all that stuff. And so here again he says, man may, if he pleases, invent a little world of his own with its own laws, for there is that in him which delights in calling up new forms, which is the nearest. And then he says, perhaps he can come to creation. And this is another thing about George MacDonald is he doesn't waste any words. Like if he sticks a word in there, it's for a reason. So he gives us he gives us that gift. He gives us a little, he's generous, right, towards us, and he says, well, we can do that. We can create something, right, out of the forms, a little world of our own. But it still has to adhere to the law.
That's why I think I was a little bit confused about this paragraph, because it seems like he's almost making the distinction, like we've made in the past, between imagination and fancy. But then he says, in either case, law has been diligently at work. So is he saying even in works of fancy, law is still diligently at work?
Yeah, and he'll expand on it. So it's probably better if we just wait. Yeah.
All right.
All right. Well, did you want me to keep going, or did I miss?
No, you're good.
Okay.
It's just me being confused.
I had to zoom in. I've got my readers on. I still am struggling to the text.
Do you want someone else to read it?
No, I got it. I can. Okay. I zoomed in, so I'm like, I know how to use a web browser, but I forgot for a second, I guess. So anyway, okay. His world, once invented, the highest law that comes next into play is that there shall be harmony between the laws by which the new world has begun to exist. And in the process of his creation, the inventor must hold by those laws. The moment he forgets one of them, he makes the story by its own postulates incredible. I think he's using that pejoratively, I'm guessing. To be able to live in a moment in an imagined world, we must see the laws of its existence obeyed. Those broken, we fall out of it.
Okay, just one minute here, because I listened again to the essay while I was carding wool, and this really stood out to me, this little thing here. The moment he forgets one of them, he makes the story by its own postulates incredible. To be able to live a moment in an imagined world, we must see the laws of its existence obey. Those broken, we fall out of it. And I thought, that's Eden. right?
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it
Mhm.
is.
It is Eden.
Yeah, that's really interesting because when he said those broken, we fall out of it, it reminded me because there's a verse in Leviticus as well where they're going back to Canaan, and God says to them, you know, if you don't adhere to these laws, the land will vomit you out. Um, but it's interesting because here it seems like he's saying that almost with any world you create, if you just create laws of just your own fancy, your own existence will not correspond to those, and then you'll find yourself breaking those laws and fall out of the world of fancy that you even created for yourself. You can create your own utopia,
Right. So
you'll fall out of it.
yeah, so what's so interesting about that is that law, right, that he's explicating here, right, is it starts in Eden, and it just fractally permeates everything, I think.
Well, what I think is interesting too, like if we kind of look at, so I've been reading reading Margaret Barker's Temple Theology and Temple Mysticism, and one of the things she talks about is just in the Holy of Holies how that would have been understood in the ancient Israelite religion, right? And in some senses, it's representative of day one of creation.
Yeah.
And it's the invisible world, but it's what holds the whole world together because the visible world is reflected in the veil around the temple, right? And it's woven like like the threads. It's a woven of the world is basically woven in four different colors in the curtains corresponding to the four elements, right?
Yeah.
And then she stacks on that this concept of the primary covenant, that like the primary priestly covenant is the covenant of peace, of shalom, and of wellness and wholeness, right? And so the way they encountered that is like if there was some kind of ritual impurity, that was a signifier that the laws of creation had been broken, and there was like the threat of chaos descending in. So those if the law was broken, there had to be some kind of atonement, right? And what I find to be interesting is the way in which consciousness perceives those laws being broken, because like we have the end of the ritual purity laws in Acts chapter 10 with the descent of the creatures in Peter's vision, right? So it's no longer the category of clean and unclean that is the signifier that covenant of peace has been violated, but something much closer to like our own actual ethical behavior was where that kind of developed. Not to say that the ethical behavior wasn't already present in the Israelite religion, because it was, but it just took on a new emphasis in the Christian tradition. And so it, to me, like what's interesting is when we think of like falling out of Eden, each age has to grapple with that through the framework of our time and place.
Yes.
Right. And so how we perceive that may look differently, but even some of the stuff like the big concern over climate change is in a sense that same inward sense that we are violating the shalom of creation. Right. We're perceiving it in a certain way. But anyway, so when he's talking about, he understands the basics of how a world gets framed. Is you cannot have an incoherent world.
Right.
There has to be a certain kind of coherence to it. And he's describing that in terms of harmony, but even in an imaginary world, he's correct. If you ever watch a story that can't world building that violates the principles of the world it's building, you can't stay in the story.
Right.
You literally can't stay in it. It's just like, this is not credible, and you toss the book or paper or whatever. So anyway.
Yeah. I thought that was a really great understanding, or a great way to frame, we must see the laws of its existence obeyed. Those broken, we fall out of it. I just thought that's so good. That's just Eden in a nutshell,
Yeah, absolutely. Did you want me to keep reading, or Josh, Jason, thoughts, guys?
Josh, any thoughts? Jason?
I do. I just wanted to let you guys finish on the whole Eden thing, because when I first read that paragraph of this essay, it led me to get to thinking about miracles, actually.
Hmm.
And why it led me to miracles is because I think I had always accepted the David Hume approach to miracles as it being something that more or less breaks the laws of reality. And when I read MacDonald's writing here, I got to thinking, like, well, wait a minute. Why did I ever assume that, even though growing up Christian, never really rejecting Christianity, but going through a sort of reconstruction and struggling with miracles a little bit, well, why do miracles seem to break reality? Well, then I'm reading MacDonald and going, oh, wait a minute, maybe they don't.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they never do break reality to start with. Maybe it's a misunderstanding of the whole structure. And then later on, I got around to reading Lewis's book, Miracles, and reading Lewis's work on miracles. I would describe that work as him kind of walking the reader through his own journey, understanding that subject. And early on, I'm kind of going, I don't know if I agree with Lewis. Then when you get like maybe halfway through, or 3/4 of the way through the book, then Lewis starts getting into talking about how, well, you could look at the miracle as kind of like an artist who paints a picture, and someone could analyze all those brush strokes, and you could look at some of these brush strokes as contrary or wrong. But that's only if you're so zoomed in, you're such a kind of an analytical view of the technique that you don't see the whole picture. And if you see the whole picture, you see that the artist, those brush strokes that seem contrary are actually correct. So seeing something then in that view of a person walking on water, rising from the dead, being born of a virgin, these things on a grander scale are actually correct. They fit with all the laws of reality, but it's only a very low level view that takes them as wrong. And it's strange to me that I came about that before reading Lewis's work by reading this paragraph in this essay.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That's
Yeah.
great. That's great. And I just keep thinking Barfield, Lewis, and even Tolkien, all they did was expand on George's ideas. Like they took them to like his work, it feels to me, and I could be totally wrong, but it feels to me like his work was the ferment that just got them going. Like Lewis does say that Phantastes baptized his imagination, right?
Mm-hmm.
And baptism is a it's a symbol of death and resurrection,
Mm-hmm.
So whatever imagination he had before died when he read MacDonald, and suddenly he had a new one, and it was a resurrected one. Like, so I can't help but think that a lot of, I don't know, maybe it's just maybe I'm just way too much of a fangirl. It's possible.
Yeah.
Well, here, C.S. Lewis.
Chad's like, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, on the back of the Phantastes, he says, "I have never concealed the fact that I regarded MacDonald as my master. Indeed, I fancy I have never written a book in which I did not quote from him." That was C.S. Lewis. So, but I mean, I think even not intentionally, you kind of do that too, because like you said, just it seeps in. Because you read his fairy stories, or his stories in general. Doesn't necessarily have to be his more intellectual work or the sermons or anything like that. If you just read his stories, like you said, they're kind of, his theology is woven into that, or it just kind of comes out. It's not woven into in like a tricky way, like he's trying to deceive anybody.
No,
And then
he's
you
not
read it, and
smuggling.
then it just, yeah, and it resonates deeply, like, and then it just ferments, and it just sits in your subconscious, and then it comes back out later. Like Fantasties, like that's what I've said before. Is like the reason I love that book is because I read it, and I'm like, wait, this happened to me. Like, and I'm like, and if it hasn't happened to me, I read it, I'm like, I feel like this is gonna happen to me because there's just something incredibly true about it. Where it's kind of like I think what we're talking about here, even in the book of Fantasties, it actually, though it's all this crazy imagery and stuff we would think to be in a realm of fancy, but it actually corresponds to what we experience in this life in so many ways. And so, I mean, you often quote the part in Fantasties about the butterflies and the girl with the butterflies. And it's like, because there's something so true about that, where like you almost lived it. Yeah.
It's personal. It's totally personal to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's story too, and like you just get to them and you just start weeping because you're like, man, like when he goes to that old lady's house, I was just like, man, I've been there. I've been there before.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah.
Well, like he says in the other essay, the imagination is the light that lights the lamp within the forms.
Mm-hmm.
And the meaning is already contained in the forms. So, all you have to do is light the lamp. And that's what he does. Like, I actually can imagine that he wrote that because that's what he sees himself doing, right? He sees the form, whatever it might be in nature, the God-given form, and he lights that up. He lights it up. He lights a lamp in it, right? So, and that's, I think, why it so deeply resonates, Jason, because it's so true. It's always true, right? And this is God speaking to us in his creation. Like, right? That's what it is. And so if you can, and in a sense, like it's just coming to me now, this is also stewarding, right? This is what Adam and Eve were to do, to steward, right? To be good stewards of in the garden.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, in a sense, this is not you imposing your philosophy onto the forms, but just simply lighting the lamp. You're just the butler. You know what I mean? Like you're just the steward, right?
Yeah.
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 There's a lot of humility in there. Yeah.
Well, I think like there's and I'm just riffing a little bit off of Josh's point on the miracle side.
Yeah.
Is I think that a miracle is like like John will use this language in his gospel, and I'm not sure if the other gospel writers do, but he used they weren't called miracles; they're called signs. Semeion is the Greek word that he would use. They're signifiers, and like it's almost like when you think of it, there's almost like a narrative structure to a signifier, right? This language, and it's and I think that those miracles are actually like exemplars of imagination, of calling something forth from that formal world into the world of actual things. And it's so I think that there's like that miraculous side of it is it's in a continuum of when we think of Jesus performing these miracles as like as the author, right? Bringing new language to bear that opens the eyes and brings that moment of ideally enlightenment and belief, right? So I think that where I like about MacDonald is he definitely sees this really fascinating connection. And I've got a little bit of like charismatic roots in my Christian practice, and so it's interesting to see it from MacDonald's perspective, is like this continuum of signification. And I don't know if that ties into much of what we were talking about in the essay, but I thought it was kind of a cool thought that you shared, Josh, and I was like, oh, that's something interesting to play with.
Yeah.
Yeah. The sign points to something, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Did you want me to get back into this? Okay.
Yep.
All right. Let me just find my spot. So I'm going to just rewind to the previous sentence. To be able to live a moment in an imagined world, we must see the laws of its existence obeyed. Those broken, we fall out of it. The imagination in us, whose exercise is essential to the most temporary submission to the imagination of another, immediately, with the disappearance of law, ceases to act. Suppose the gracious creatures of some childlike region of fairyland, talking either Cockney or Gascon, would not the tale, however lovely begun, sink at once to the level of the burlesque, of all forms of literature the least worthy? A man's inventions may be stupid or clever, but if he hold not by the laws of them, or if he only makes one law jar with another, he contradicts himself as an inventor. He is no artist. He does not rightly consort his instruments, or he tunes them in different keys. The mind of man is the product of live law. It thinks by law. It dwells in the midst of law. It gathers from law its growth. With law, therefore, can it alone work to any result. Inharmonious, unconsorting ideas will come to a man, but if he try to use one of such, his work will grow dull, and he will drop it from mere lack of interest. Law is the soil in which alone beauty will grow. Beauty is the only stuff in which truth can be clothed. And if you will, call imagination the tailor that cuts her garments to fit her, and fancy his journeyman that puts the pieces of them together, or perhaps at most embroiders their buttonholes. Obeying law, the maker works like his creator. Not obeying law, he is such a fool as heaps piles of stones and calls them a church.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts, anybody?
Go ahead, Josh. You look like you're.
Yeah, I think
we got a question. We've got a question from Kate here too. I wanted to.
Law at its work. Does that work?
Yeah, he's going to get into it, Kate. He's going to he's going to make it more clear as he goes on. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Josh, you were about to jump in and say something there.
I was going to say, I think that I find for myself, I know there have been many distinctions made with others, and I'm not well versed on, but I think Carl Jung, I think, I'm blanking on the name right now, one of the Romantic poets, but there's been distinctions made about imagination.
Oh, Coleridge, you think?
Yeah, Coleridge, yes, you're right. And I think that I find myself finding McDonald's distinction the most easily digestible, the most easily graspable. That calling imagination and fantasy, these two things that are closely related here, but the distinction, I don't know if I can really articulate it in a different way than McDonald does, but I find myself gravitating towards it because I think it's just really good. And I think the fact that it uses a different word, I think someone uses the imaginal or the imaginary sometimes gets used. And another thing to throw out there maybe it's throwing out two things at once, but I don't know if you guys are familiar with if I remember right, what's called the Great War between Lewis and Barfield.
I never read the book, but I know about it.
Yeah, and I think Barfield really pushed Lewis to consider the imagination as a sort of primary function of the human being in grasping reality.
Yeah, truth-bearing faculty or something, right? Yeah,
it's something like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it's actually something like, and he gets into this. He used that image of the tailor, and I'd like to dive into that image because I think
good.
And I like to kind of zoom in and zoom out on a couple of things, and I would be curious as to what you think. But like he's essentially saying, like, he's drawing this profound connection between beauty and truth, which would John Keats would agree. So he's got this profound connection between two of the transcendentals, goodness, beauty, and truth are these transcendental realities. And I think, like, in a sense, to just kind of, I don't know where he's going to go in this essay because I haven't read it. But to Kate's question, I think that the law is connected to the truth, and the beauty is like the expression of that truth, right? And
it's the soil. The law is the soil in which beauty
right.
grows.
And it's the imagination. And the imagination, I think, begins with vision. It begins with a perceptive capacity to generate an image. And that's what adorns beauty with her clothing, right? So if you think about it just at the physical level of sight, this is kind of like what I'm doing right now is I'm perceiving, actually, like, there's layers and layers and layers of this reality that I don't see at all. I don't see down at the subatomic level. I see a computer screen, which is matter arranged in a certain way, but my vision is filtering things out and is emphasizing certain things. I'm not seeing the whole picture by any means, but then my mind is constructing, images based on what coming through my optic nerve, right? And so there's a vision component to the imagination as well. And it's actually what I'm doing right now as I'm perceiving the world, because I'm not perceiving the world as it is. I'm perceiving a mental construct that approximates the world that I'm in.
Right.
And so, like, I think what McDonald is actually driving at is a kind of a form of imagination that is less woo-woo than people tend to think imagination is just that's outside of reality. And he's saying, no, it's deeply embedded within reality.
Mm-hmm.
And like, we actually can't perceive reality at all without imagination.
Yeah.
So when you get into maybe those more of the hidden truths or the inner beauty, it takes a special kind of spiritual vision to draw those out and to give them form and shape, adorn them with form and shape.
Yeah.
And all we're doing in a sense is there's this, there's a pre-visionary apprehension in the mind that we attach language or we attach images to try to describe a sense that's much deeper than language itself. And so, I don't know, when I see what he's saying there, I'm like, whoa, he's like saying something incredibly profound about the imagination, adorning beauty.
Yeah.
Because how I'm perceiving that may be different than how like Josh perceives it or different than how Jason perceives it. So I don't know. That's how that image grabs me as far as just the Taylor image. And I think he's actually, like, in just a couple of short sentences, has described an incredible, like a pretty powerful process.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure how to compartmentalize all that in my head. I'm not even sure if I'm supposed to, but to riff on it a little bit, when you're talking, law is the soil in which alone beauty will grow. And when you're talking about being clothed with the imagination, one thing that helped me, first I'll say this, when I was even just thinking about the imagination, is the fact that the word image is in it. And so that was, like, it's incredibly simple, but that kind of helped me for some reason, just kind of thinking of that, and that it's not just some like fleeting, airy thing. It's actually a lot more real than I give it credit for. But then when you're talking about clothing, and what's going on with the law and truth here as well, I don't know if this will tie in well, the virginity, and when you talk about virginity as more in dedication, the idea of dedication or being dedicated to one husband, so not necessarily of never having anything like that, but being dedicated to one husband or one law, you could say, or one truth. But then this part in 2 Samuel I thought was really interesting, is it's when Amnon rapes his sister Tamar, and the whole Absalom story spurns off of that. But so he basically takes her, and then she cries out afterwards, and she tears her robe, and it says that she had on a robe of many colors. It says, and then it has weird caveat, and it says she had on a robe of many colors, for the king's virgin daughters wore such apparel. And I always thought that was really interesting. Because there's that song you sent me, Sherry, too, the She's a Rainbow
Yeah.
something. There's
Yeah.
like the multiplicity of all the colors is hidden within creation or something. And it's within like the feminine. And when that is virgin to the law, it can be properly clothed with all those colors, with all that multiplicity or something like that. That's kind of where my mind was going with that. It takes of all those colors and clothes itself in a higher truth that aligns or corresponds with a higher truth as well.
Mhm. George MacDonald uses that metaphor quite a bit, actually, even in the other essay, the clothing of thought with creation itself. That's that one favorite quote of mine. Allow us, the homely figure. The world is the human being turned inside out, right? A wardrobe with which we clothe our thoughts. And because I'm such a fangirl, that's where the wardrobe comes from in the Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe, folks. And the lamp in Narnia is the lamp, right, that lights the lamp, or the light that lights the lamp in the forms, right? Your imagination is the light that lights the lamp in the forms. And so that's where you begin. You begin in Narnia at the lamp, right? Your imagination lights it, and then the whole world opens up. And yeah.
Well, and it's like if you use another like example from modern science, like reality does not exist without the observer.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually the observer that collapses reality.
I hate that propositional statement.
Wait,
Isn't that if a tree falls in the forest, does anybody hear? Is it that one?
Right. Well, it goes into
same
like
principle.
Schrodinger's experiment, right? The Schrodinger's cat that's in the box,
Mhm.
in the box, it's neither alive nor is the cat alive or dead. The answer is yes. Right. It's not until something is observed that it takes on reality. But if you think about like how a dog perceives, like, let's say that field of truth, that soil of truth gives rise to a field of sunflowers. Right. And in order for those sunflowers to truly exist in their fullest sense, somebody has to see them for what they are, right? So there are animals that do perceive those sunflowers, but don't perceive them within the color spectrum. Or you can have like, dogs and a lot of other mammals that have red-green color blindness. So they're perceiving them differently. But we perceive it within the full spectrum of visible light. Or at least our ability to see that spectrum is broader, so we perceive them differently.
Except for birds. Birds see everything.
Yeah, and the birds see a different, but they're perceiving it. So in order for that sunflower to exist as a sunflower in its fullest sense, it takes all of those layers and levels of observation that give rise to what it is. Like, in a sense, that's kind of, it's weird, but that's where physics is.
I wrote a poem about that, Jed. I have to read it. It's really, really short.
Sure.
Here.
That's really interesting. I want to comment on that as well.
Okay, it says, they block my path on the way to the outhouse. Each head bobs precariously on bowed backs, smiling, bright, and eternally optimistic. I don't know their names, but they are everywhere. These stretch ever more tenuously across my path, asking to be seen. But what is my eye to them? Must it fall like the sun across their faces, a less glorious but still luminous orb? It seems to be so.
That's really good.
It's called Yellow Flowers.
Oh,
that's really good.
Really good. Yellow
What I
flowers.
was thinking is that's kind of to say that everything exists relationally, right? And so the cat in the box is not living nor dead because it has
because it has no observational relationship.
Okay, well, here's the problem. Now, maybe I just don't see it the way you do, Jed, but here's the problem I have. What about the fairies?
What about the fairies?
Yeah, because they see it, even when
they're not in the box.
But Sometimes we don't see them. But like
No, I
the
mean,
fairies,
they see the world, they see the sunflowers, they see the tree that falls in the forest,
Mhm.
even when we don't.
right?
Yeah,
So
I think that's
the thought experiment, like obviously, like if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? Insofar as we are not observing the tree, we can't. No, it doesn't. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't make a sound. Like
Right. Yeah.
it's a thought experiment that demonstrates an aspect of physics, right? Which is
Yeah.
that absent a relationship with an observer. Now there are other observers in that forest, and so that
Yeah.
obviously it's not
Mhm.
like if I'm not in the forest, that tree doesn't exist or it doesn't make a sound, but it has to be observed in order for it to exist,
Mhm.
right? There has to be a relationship, a subject object relationship, essentially.
So
But
between
then that's the other problem I have is it objectifies everything outside of myself. Right?
Not really. Like, I mean, it
No?
can't.
Mm.
Like, yes, that's called idolatry, right?
Okay. Well, hey, that's helpful. See, I
But
learned something.
like the aim of, like, I would say, like the kind of final participation type consciousness is intersubjectivity.
Yeah.
And Henri Bergson will talk about that as far as the sympathetic imagination, like we've talked about, is like you have to not only see the object, but you're seeing yourself in the object,
Yes.
and the object is perceiving itself in you.
Well,
And
that's
so,
exactly what I was doing with the yellow flowers, right?
right.
Like they were
Yeah.
stretching across my path, you know, wanting me to look at them.
Yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah.
guess that the idea is if the flower existed in some black oblivion and there was not only not you, but nothing at all to observe it, like does it
Then it doesn't
actually
make-
exist? Because
No.
it has no relationship with anything else. And so that's the idea of, I guess, see what hell would be, as if you're just in complete isolation,
That is hell.
separated
Yeah.
from everything, and you're just stuck with yourself. It's like, do you actually even exist at that point? You could try to argue all you want that you do, but you're only arguing with yourself, and then what do you do? That's
Oh my
like, so I don't know. That's really fascinating though. But it's interesting, as even you mentioned the cat in the box, and even thinking of how we often get ourselves stuck in our own little boxes, or even in our own boxed in way of thinkings, and think that can shut ourselves off from different ways of existence, or different ways of like a different luminous orb, like you're talking about, Sherry, crossing our path and giving us new life. When we're just closing ourselves in a box from any passerby to
Mhm.
interact with. But it also made me, and here's one thing I thought was interesting, it made me think, gosh, and this is something that stuck with me. I think you mentioned it a long time ago, Sherry, and I don't even know if we were recording or not, but I think you mentioned something about puppies and how they have to spend like first week without sight or something
Mhm.
like that.
Yeah, their eyes
And
don't
it just
open for 10 days. Yeah.
yeah, it just made me, for some reason, it made me think of that, and like how if everything exists relationally, they're learning in a way. They're in a box, like they're shut off from sight.
They're in the
Box off
world
from
of the
subjectivity.
senses. They're in the world of I'm listening to on Martin Shaw's recommendation, I got the audible version of David Abrams' The Spell of the Sensuous.
Hmm.
Highly recommend it, you guys. Like it's amazing. The world of the senses and the interconnectedness of I just got to the part where he was in Bali, and his story is quite interesting because he was a magician, but he was doing magic to put himself through university to become an anthropologist.
That sounds dangerous. So, like, for money? That sounds
What?
really risky. He was doing magic for money?
Yeah, he was doing
Oh.
magic, performing in restaurants and stuff like that, you know?
Oh, that kind of magic. I thought you meant like doing some
No,
weird
he
sort of,
wasn't, like, making
witchcraft magic
counterfeit bills.
spells.
No.
Some-
And he was
Okay.
putting himself through university, and anyway, he got picked up for a research project with indigenous shamans. Okay? And the reason they picked him up for that was because he was an anthropologist, but he was also a magician. And a good one. And so they asked him if he could, basically embed himself into the shaman, into their life as a magician, right? To learn magic from them. and to share magic with them. And so all of his writings come out of this experience, and it's really, really fascinating. But anyway, he was talking about how he was staying with this one shaman and his wife in Bali, and every morning she would go with, she had these leaves with a little pile of rice on there, and she had 4 of them, and she would kind of duck around a corner, and then she'd come back without them, and he didn't know what she was doing with them. And then she explained that they were food for the spirits, right, of the ancestors that were there.
Mm-hmm.
And so after she left, he went around and looked to see where she put them, and she put them at the 4 corners of the house. And by the time he went to look, there was nothing left on them. And so he thought, well, that's really interesting. So then the next morning when she did it, he kind of snuck out right behind her after she left to see what took the rice. And he said, to my surprise, the rice was moving on the leaves. And he looked, and it was ants. And they were carting off these little pieces of rice, and there was an anthill over here, an anthill over, at each corner of the house. And then he talks about, and I can't even do it justice. He talks about the ancestor, the spirit, right? See, I'm already struggling at how to articulate this, but it's not only is it spiritual, but it's also functional. It keeps the ants away from the house, okay? Because every day they get their share of food. And so they don't invade the house. But it's also the spirit of the ancestors, because it's been it's been carried on for centuries, right? To do this. But this spirit of the ancestors is also embedded in the ants themselves, right? Because they carry off the food as the ancestors, right? So it's this like super intertwined web of relationality in the natural world that he is talking about, and I don't know why I started talking about that. What were we talking about before this?
We were talking about Schrodinger's experiment, and we were talking about
right, yeah, we were
the
talking
power of the imagination. But I think
yes,
one of
and
the things that came up, this will sound like a little woo woo, but like it was in a time of like contemplation, I was thinking about like the fairies, right? And like how we perceive them in our minds. And I think that realm, like the imaginal realm, like they adorn themselves with our imaginations, right? And so, that's the medium through which there is an interaction. Because you could just say, well, it's the ants coming in and taking the food. But they're seeing this in a much more holistic, for lack of a better term, an economy of being.
Yes.
An exchange that is far more encompassing than just the ants coming to pick up their fuel for the day, right? And
well, it has to be.
I'm not so certain. Like, I mean, obviously, like that can't be. That's a certain kind of perception that cannot be quantified,
right?
So it would be difficult to like corroborate that scientifically. However, like the perceptions of those shamans and their communities, they give that reality a whole different layer of understanding that sees themselves embedded with an overall continuity with themselves and their ancestors, because their ancestors are still present and they're eating the food.
In their tradition, in the fact that she does that every morning.
And they're probably not unaware that it's the ants as well. They probably know this, right?
Yeah, but because they see everything is so connected.
Yeah.
This is the thing. Like we've abstracted everything out, right? And I think the reason I started talking about that was because of the the subjective objective divide, right? And the way this way of looking at the natural world that doesn't include you, right? And like the note that I put on that poem at the bottom is the participative anthropic principle. The observers are necessary for the universe to be born. What's always bothered me about that is how narcissistic that sounds. You know?
Okay, so let me play with that, Sherry, because that's
Yeah, please help me with it.
partially just because I'm so wicked, but so
I can comment on that too.
so narcissism is a deflection of a deeper and more radiant reality that
Well,
is the
yes,
human,
okay. I can
right?
say yes to that.
Right. So I think that, like, there are, and this is within multiple mystic traditions, but especially within the Christian tradition, because of our incarnational understanding of
Mhm.
deity, right? Is that the human being is the measure of creation,
Yes. Yes.
right? And like, so we as and Josh, I don't know your spiritual background, so if I'm stepping on toes here, apologies, but like, Paul's pretty clear that all creation is summed up in one human being, right?
Mhm.
Recapitulated, is made new, and is held together in and through the personal agency of a human. And I think that is maybe one of the more enduring and troubling and radical claims of Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And because there is also the deeper implication of, like, Christian doctrines of theosis, that just as, we will be like that, at least at some point, we cross a threshold where we are also like that. And so, it kind of, especially like in a contemporary setting where we have an interesting way of elevating ourselves in a narcissistic way, and at the same time actually debasing ourselves while we do that,
Mhm. Yeah.
is that, like, narcissism is actually a falling away of the far deeper
Profound.
significance of what it
Yeah.
means to be
Yeah.
human.
Yeah.
And so it's
Yeah,
like the anthropic principle, like, I take I don't think scientists would agree with me on this, but I think certain theologians would, like Jordan Daniel probably would agree on this, and so would John Bear, is that we don't have a high enough anthropology.
Yes, exactly. I totally agree with you.
And so, and I mean,
But it's so easy, don't you think? Okay, so there's a poem at the beginning of one of the chapters of in Fantastes by Henry Sutton, who George MacDonald knew personally. At the time that he wrote Fantastes. So he included his friend's poem, which I thought, oh, I'm fangirling again. Okay. So it says, man doth usurp all space, stares thee in rock, bush, river in the face. Never thine eyes behold a tree. 'Tis no sea thou seest in the sea. 'Tis but a disguised humanity. To avoid thy fellow, vain thy plan. All that interests a man is man. And, you could read that as a totally narcissistic poem, or you could read it as the more profound understanding and of what you were just talking about, Jed, that, right? That Christ was a human being, right? Like Bear says, he shows us what it is to be God in the way that he dies as a human being. Okay. And what's interesting about the chapter that follows this poem is it's when Anodos goes out and he starts noticing, like, in his peripheral vision, he starts to see things moving in the dark, or he thinks he sees a person over there. But then when he looks straight at it, it's just a rock. And George actually uses the same rock, bush, and river, right? He uses the same words. It's just a rock or a bush, right? And what I found when I was reading Fantastes that was so beautiful about that description was that in your peripheral vision, when you see the shape of something, you see it for what it is. But when you look straight at it, it loses its shape. Okay. It's like exactly the same thing Josh was talking about. When you look at the painting and you get real up close, right? And all you see is the brush strokes, and they don't look like they make any sense to you, right? But if you get that distance away from it, then suddenly you see the whole thing. You see the shape of it, right? And for me, that was those two things together, this poem and that chapter, really helped me to understand why you don't want to necessarily hyper focus in on something, like lay it bare, right? Jason helped me understand the symbolism of the sun in George MacDonald's writings, because in the sun everything is made clear, right? And we see things by the light of the sun, but the moon gives them all different shapes, right? And the moon is the feminine, so it's that veiled perception of the world that you enter, and suddenly the bush looks like a man and the rock looks like a man, and right. So anyway, I don't know if I'm making any sense, but
yeah. Well, and I think that, like, David Bentley Hart is a big fan of George MacDonald, and I love his writing. And he writes something, and this is echoed also in Sergei Bulgakov, who sees the divine humanity as something that is essential within God. Like, it's an essential reality within God. And David Bentley Hart argues that God cannot become something that he isn't in some way already. Right. So even the incarnation did not represent a change in the Godhead. It was a natural or essential outworking of divinity to incarnate.
Well, I was thinking about this today, Jed. Jesus is the firstborn, right? The first fruits, the firstborn of creation, right? So what does that mean? Like, he says, tetelestai on the cross, it is finished, right? Creation is now done.
Yeah.
Everything that comes after that, right, is created. Everything that comes, and before, right? Because it's before the foundation of the world, but like we can try to wrap. But Jesus says to somebody in the Gospels, let the dead bury the dead, right? Come follow me and let the dead bury the dead. So, the living are already dead, right? And they're not created. They're created at the cross, right? The lamb is slain before the foundation of the world, creation. So I don't know what I'm trying to say with that.
Well, I think what's interesting is that's the beginning of the anthropic principle, is Calvary.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
And
in the right sense.
And in the sense where it humanizes, and in a way to say it from a different angle, is it familiarizes everything. It brings everything into a set of familial relations.
Right.
Under one Father, there's one cosmic family. And to see things as human, not in a narcissistic way, but in a likeness, in an imaging kind of sense. What do we got here?
That looks like a cockroach, no? Or a big beetle.
Eat it.
Sorry, that's why I jumped away. It was flying above me. It's got these huge pinchers. Look at that.
Wow.
What do with it? Sorry, I'm gonna go try to get rid of him somewhere.
You can just eat him, man.
Yeah, I feel bad smushing him because we've just been talking about nature. Now everything's interconnected, and I'm like,
nature dished you a tasty snack, Jason.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. I would just stomp on that thing.
It's terrifying. Yeah. But anyway, yeah, just the humanized creation is in that healthy anthropic sense, is you're establishing a relationship of familiarity.
Yeah.
Right. And and familiarity in that sense of like that familial bond between all things. And I don't think that that's to say that like everything is human in exactly the same way, but there's a human element to all creation,
Yes,
right?
I agree. I totally agree with that. But like George MacDonald does talk about, you know, the fractal layers. Like in the other essay, he talks about the, you know, the superfluous and the depths and so on, right? Like there's all these ways of seeing these things, and some people will just see them that way and others won't. Others will see below the surface, right? Or whatever. He also mentions that, I think, in here, however clever or stupid, you know, and this is the thing that I would call like the two sides to every story, or the two sides to every coin. You know, you have this beautiful anthropic principle, but then you have this really flat, idolatrous, like you said, anthropic principle, right?
Right. So I guess that would be the question I'd toss out to you guys, and I hope it's okay if I ask, but like, what's the difference between a healthy anthropology and an unhealthy anthropology? Because I think that does tie into the question of imagination intimately.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say earlier, when we were talking about the narcissist, is that in the story of in the Greek myth, he's staring at his own reflection. So he's not actually looking at other things. He's not looking at other people. And it was reminding me of, like, you know, you walk by the whole street and there's like homeless people, you know, or just anybody who's like could be sad, and it's like how happy they are when someone else notices them. And so you're not gazing at yourself. I mean, you are in a way, because everything's because you find that you are, because you exist relationally. So you discover later on that you are you're connected with everything. But if you're just gazing at yourself, I don't know, it's not nice. I mean, if you are gazing at yourself, it's narcissism. But if you're just looking out on the world, loving the flower, like talking about gazing at that flower, you're not doing it in a narcissistic fashion, because you're not even looking at your own image in the mirror. You aren't, kind of, in a way, because like you said, everything is within man, but you're not thinking of yourself, I guess you could say. It's not an obsession with yourself. And that was just, I don't know, my own thoughts about it. And it would be, you know, I think it does apply at all levels, even the little ants and things like that. I might have to move inside. He's back. Oh no.
He likes you. You must be wearing the right cologne.
Sorry, take it away, Josh.
These guys are all about pheromones, you know.
What does that mean?
Smells.
Oh.
I don't think this fully gets at your question, but I think co-creation is a partial answer to it, at least, in that I don't know if I can really talk about any other way other than bringing up human sexuality, and that you have something like masturbation versus sexuality between man and woman who can bring about new life. There is new creation, more life that happens. There was what's that song? I don't listen to a lot of pop music. I think it's a Justin Bieber song where there's a line like, "Why don't you go and love yourself?" Something like that comes up to me, and I don't know. I don't know if I can really articulate it very well. That's, I think, why I go to more creative, more poetic type answers, because how do you really define where that line is?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think that the parallel between masturbation and baby making is appropriate.
I do too. Yeah, it's really
Right.
good.
I think that that's a very apt way. And I think, like, when you're talking about the imagination, there is no way to remove eros from that equation, you know. But I think like one of the things that is like vital, like, where we get into like kind of objectifying the created realm, is when we forget, and we
Yeah.
forget our primary, like, or when we look into the world of multiplicity and see a world of just mere objects
Yeah.
that are more or less useful to us and whatever our agendas in the world are, right? If we get to that place, that is the narcissistic kind of masturbatory approach to life, right? Is, you know, this object can bring me pleasure, or I can derive some benefit out of this object, whatever it is, relationship, you know, money, whatever the object happens to be. And I think the call away from idolatry is a call back to oneness,
Yeah.
back to the one, right? And so I think like the call to worship the Lord your God and serve him only is not like a I mean, it's a law. It's the soil through which all reality and beauty grows, right? Is not because like God is like, you know, in some sort of narcissistic need. Is that we need that primary organizing principle to set our relationship with the whole domain of reality to right, so we can see like not a world of different objects, but in a sense we can see how God is imaged forth in creation, and then our relationship to creation becomes a mode in which we are actually relating to God, so that when I see the neighbor, I'm seeing Jesus, right? And I think that, you know, that's what he's calling us to in, you know, his great commandments, and in what he's warning against in his judgment parables, is when we don't see that. The reason why we don't see him in others is because we don't perceive God first.
Yeah, that's the two-story universe, right? God lives upstairs and we live downstairs.
Yeah, you don't you want to have a good, at least a good staircase.
I think there's a
Um,
story about that in the Bible, no?
I do believe there is. I do believe there is. If you guys want to keep reading, I just got to step away, take a quick little break here, but I will be right back.
Yeah, sure. Any more thoughts, Josh or Jason? No?
Not at the moment. I think I'm fading a little bit.
Are ya?
Yeah, getting to my bedtime.
Yeah. Yeah, it's getting late there, eh? Well, we could actually call it an evening because I think we did a lot of talking about some really meaty things here, and I don't want to overdo it. So we'll wait for Jed to get back. One of the things that I thought of when I thought of his question about the difference between narcissism and, you know, seeing past like it's basically idolatry, right? It's Barfield's book, Saving the Appearances. Study in idolatry. It's the same principle, but I thought of Douglas Harding when he talks about the 4 stages of life, and in the 4 stages of life, you have the, you know, the infant and the toddler, the teenager, and the sage. And the teenager gets to a place where they look in the mirror and they believe that that's who they are. And you know, he says at one point in his talk that that's where most people end up staying, right? And he compares that to the toddler or the infant who doesn't know where their body ends and the rest of the world begins. Like they're just kind of like melded in, right, to their mother. It's like they're part of her body. They're part of nature, you know. They go outside, they're the grass, they're the trees, they're the birds. They can imagine all of that without even batting an eye, you know. They can be it. But the teenager looks in the mirror one day and says, that's who I am, right? And for Harding, they're believing a lie, because that's not who they are, because what they're looking at is death, right? And what they are isn't. That's how he phrases it. And I think that's a really great way to think about how the imagination could change that for you. If you can look at yourself in the mirror and say, this is not what I am. Because that thing in the mirror, excuse me, the thing in the mirror is a really good representation of what you aren't, because it's in the mirror. It's behind a piece of glass. It's hard. It's cold. It's lifeless, right? And that's not what you are. And
But could you sorry, I'm kind of, could you say that it's part of what you are a little, because isn't part of what you are a little bit of self-reflection? It's just when you're stuck there, then you become the narcissist. It's when you're stuck.
For Harding, what you are is headless, right?
Ah,
you're headless because, like, he does these experiments where he points. He has you pointing. So you point at something in the room and you point at something else and something else. And every time you do that, you can see your finger and you can see the object that you're pointing at. Okay. You can see both those things. But then he says, point at yourself. And what do you see? You only see your finger, because you can't see yourself. So for him, you're headless. And what that means is you are the other. Okay. Like the big O, like you're creation. You're the person in front of you. You're the people in the room. You're the cosmos. You're all of that. Right. And so when you look in the mirror and you see yourself, and like he said, he uses the example of the toddler or the parent saying, look, Johnny, there's you. That's you in the mirror. And the kid goes, okay, mostly to make his parents happy, because he doesn't see himself as that thing behind the glass. Right.
Yeah.
But the teenager all of a sudden does. And so what happens is they've lost their headlessness. Right. They believe that that's who they are, and what they are is not. They are everything else. And I mean, it would be too much of an explanation, I think, to.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm not completely sold on it, I guess. I completely agree that they are everything else. I guess just I still wonder, the seeing oneself in the mirror seems like when you find something, like you find your own personal identity, and I'm usually kind of pushing against this, so I don't know why I'm pushing for it now, because like I'm usually like, this does nobody any good. Like, it's best to just forget about yourself and go on about your day.
You just want to fight with me.
But well, no, I guess just because there seems to be an aspect where it almost seems necessary for individuality that a unity could exist. So there is, well, I mean, if you a distinction or something, so you discover yourself, that you are different somehow than everything you're pointing at, but everything you're pointing at is still you, because it bears weight on who you are. But that seeing yourself is kind of like a fall in a way. Something like,
well, there you go. I was just going to say, this is exactly what happens. This is the garden, right? This is when.
Is that necessary? That's what I'm wondering. Is it necessary for?
It is necessary. I believe it's part of the U-shaped journey, right? Because like Douglas Harding says, when that teenager, he says, no wonder teenagers are so angry, because the whole world has been taken away from them, and that's all they are, right? But the goal is not to stay there. The goal is to learn to, like the sage for Harding is the elder who learns to reincorporate the child. Okay. And that is exactly what Barfield talks about with original participation. That's exactly what that is. It's the same thing. And, but you have to have that fall into duality, right? That fall into the world of, black and white and yes and no and all that, because
well, like the world is out here and I am here in this mirror, and it all of a sudden becomes duality, and it's like, well,
I would just simply say what the Bible says. Then you get tossed out of the garden and into the thorns, which is pain and suffering, and it's through that pain and suffering that you learn that you are everything.
Or Irenaeus says, like, It's this. It's you're into the school of righteousness. That's where
Yeah.
you learn.
Yeah.
What's interesting is as you're saying that, like I keep hearing like just that again, to remember, right?
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And we had a little discussion on that in the Voxer group. I won't give all the context here, but like the remembering, the Hebrew term is across languages, which is interesting, is there's a phallic element to it, a masculine element to remembering. It actually, refers to, it's a phallic
wow.
image,
Really?
right?
Yeah.
And it's a remembering, right? So memory is a kind of a way of saying remember is to reincarnate, right? Is to perceive yourself in a very different way. And I'm going to lose battery power here, so I'm going to probably drop in a second. And I apologize, I didn't bring my charger with.
It's okay.
But to remember is an incarnational thing, right? And so just in a sense, you have to get beyond just seeing the mirror image of yourself. Another way to perceive yourself is transparent. So when you're looking at yourself, you can see all things by seeing through yourself, right? So there's like in my meditation practice, there's like a certain imaginal place that I go where one of the things that emerges is a transparent self that emerges from like an Edenic type of a scene. So it's from a pool of water in this, where the tree of life is. And out from that emerges this mirror image, but it's a transparent, clear, crystalline, clear self. And you can see, that heavenly dimension, that reality, that realm, but you're looking through yourself as you're seeing it. Yeah. Because you become you're perceiving through yourself, but you're not perceiving yourself at the same time. There's a kenosis element to remembering.
Yeah.
It's a self-emptying, but it's because there's a fullness of self that is already present that can be emptied. Right. And so that ego formation, Jason, I think is something that is actually an important process in our formation as creatures. Right. It's just that if you get stuck there, it's like staying a toddler forever. Well, being a toddler, there's nothing inherently wrong with being a toddler. As challenging as it can be.
Well, Harding would say it's being a teenager forever,
right?
And being angry and resentful and bitter because the whole world has been taken away from you. And I think that his description of it is, for me anyway, it's the best description I've ever heard. It's exactly what Barfield talks about with original participation, withdrawal, and final participation. It's the same concept, but I just love that image that he has. But I'm going to wrap it up now before you disappear on us.
Okay. Yeah. I will be like Michael J. Fox's brothers and sister, his brother and sister in Back to the Future, that picture.
You'll start fading.
Yeah. I'd love to come back and touch on mirrors too, though, because all sorts of stuff is going through my mind. Mirrors and narcissism and the Cosmos
and
Magic
George
Mirror.
McDonald, Cosmo.
Yeah. And he makes that statement, all mirrors are magic mirrors. And so I don't know. There's just a lot there. So.
There's a lot. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, we can get back to it. Okay. So do we want to do this next week, same time?
I can probably swing close to that. Josh, it was an absolute pleasure getting a chance to meet you. By the way, feel free to jump in and interrupt. Sherry and I think, and Jason are so used to talking. You can always jump in and grab that conversational lead. I don't want you to feel like you have to wait or anything like that. But it was awesome getting a chance to meet you. And this is going to be, a lot of fun.
Yeah, really good. Yeah. All right. I'm going to say goodnight and just hang on one minute.
Okay.